So what happens if there's a dysfunctional orchestra? The whole picture can go bad. We could have primary and secondary processing. That is, we could have unskilled, poorly functioning primary processes. We all know kids whose language skills or nonverbal skills are not developing well. That would be akin to having an orchestra in which maybe the conductor is trying his best, but our musicians are behind. They're not able to adequately perform on their given instrument. They're not effectively able to read and interpret the symbols of the musician, the musical score. You're not going to be sending forth good information. If the posterior processing parts of our brain that are responsible for accurately, clearly, completely, and relevantly processing information and assigning meaning can't do that, think what a position that puts the frontal lobe in, the prefrontal cortex specifically. The decision-making process is only as good as the quality of the information the rest of the brain sends forward. So if we have unskilled or inattentive or ineffective musicians, and if we top that with a certain disorder, a diagnosis, or an acquired injury that takes out the conductor and layers on top of that deficits in executive functions, we now have no one functional piece of the prefrontal cortex that can effectively determine, decide, regulate, initiate, modulate. Now we're at a complete loss. And so what kinds of outcomes would we expect? You could have, if we had ideally intact language and an intact executive function system, we've got a really well-rounded orchestra. We have a lovely end product, and it's something that as an audience, either the audience being the people we interact with at school, at home, in the community, at work, our peers, our teachers, the adults, the parents, the general audience is pleased with that output. If you have deficit language, the unskilled musicians, but a relatively intact, there's no reason with your neurological development to have problems with the prefrontal cortex. Yet you've got deficit language development. How can you give the prefrontal cortex the nuts and bolts that it needs to be the effective conductor? That's one scenario. Another scenario would be perhaps you can have intact language, well-developed processing skills. But if you specifically have deficits with executive functions, how well will that conductor use those language skills? They won't. And in fact, many of these disorders that we will talk about later on in this lecture show that. You might have technically okay language skills, but if there is a deficit in the prefrontal cortex, now we have an incompetent conductor. Now we don't have the ability to judge, to determine, to plan, to organize, to sequence, to initiate, to terminate, to control and inhibit. And of course, if you had deficit language and deficit executive functions, the end result is probably the worst of all four scenarios. Deficit language, let's just explore one of those. Deficit language, but intact executive functions. Again, I briefly kind of touched on this point with the previous slide. If language is deficit, if you've got a child in your caseload with language problems, whatever they may be, what will happen to that child's ability to use and apply that linguistic, symbolic knowledge? How can that child think, reason, self-regulate, self-observe, self-monitor, generate alternative strategies, generate novel creative problem solving. How does that child who has the deficit language do that? And that's another key worry, I think, for a lot of the children in our caseloads. It's like the bigger picture. It's like the extension of language. We know, as SLPs, we know those kids with language deficits don't do as well. You observe them, and their thinking is not as effective. Their reasoning is not as efficient. Do they use language to their advantage to double-check their work, to identify mistakes, to rehearse or to repeat information, instructions, explanations, ideas, suggestions? They don't. So, with language not supporting, and that's a sort of another area that is more recently being researched. What happens with the so-called specific language impaired child? Do they have a profile of executive function deficits? And what might we be able to do to support the development of normal executive functions? All right, so in your own caseload, what could you predict for the kids who have both language deficits and deficit executive functions? What kind of problem solving, functional skills, reasoning, self-control might we expect? And the reason I keep alluding to and mentioning all of these specific areas, planning, regulation, monitoring, organization, initiation, those are all specific components of executive functions. And we will start speaking of those directly in this very next slide. But I kind of wanted to give you an overview, an introductory concept to who are the kids that we might be talking about, who in your own caseload might you be thinking of as we go through these next sets of slides, and which children do these slides apply to. So to summarize, executive functions are the result of a neural mechanism which takes about 2 full decades to develop normally, in the normally developing human. They are tertiary processing, so they are the ultimate endpoint for the processing of all incoming information. We've studied primary, we've talked about secondary. We realize children with auditory or visual processing deficits will have difficulty with the meaning of language. What happens when the meaning of language isn't there to support the development of these executive functions? It means we lack those tertiary networks to really help us exert control and enable and allow for behaviors. And remember, I talked about the frontal lobe, the motor strip, and the premotor strip are really there to plan, execute, and initiate deliberate, purposive, effective, useful motor movements. And if you go to the more anterior third of the frontal lobe, that piece of it is there to plan, deliberate, organize, sequence, and initiate behaviors. Our behaviors are conscious. They are independent. We want to generate behaviors that are purposeful and goal-oriented and that serve in some fashion to advance our efforts. Our behaviors deliberately monitor and evaluate the outcome and the success of our efforts. And they have to be flexible and they have to be adaptive. Rules always change. The constraints of an environment always change. Our behaviors have to adapt. If we have inflexible, maladaptive behavior, then how successful are we in the grand scheme of things? Okay. I need to talk a little bit about 3 underlying cognitive processes that support the development of executive functions. I'm going to pause for just a second. Okay, so 3 underlying cognitive processes. There are a variety of ways that different researchers and authors have, over the years, defined and broken apart the general term of executive functions. And I think, for me, the one that makes the most sense divides this broad umbrella term into 3 cognitive processes. And then later on we'll talk about 6 components of executive functions. And so, what are those 3 underlying foundational cognitive processes? One is attention. It's the most basic foundational process that we have other than being alert. And it's one of the most early emerging, developing, and the earliest maturing of all of these processes and executive functions.